switch a little bit the timeline now, and I talk about the last 90 years, more or less. Before I also worked during the Holocene, and now my research focuses more on microplastics in German rivers. So in fact, these new contaminants have a size of smaller than 5 millimeters, and they are found everywhere in the environment. And I think all of you have read this in the papers, and there are many researchers who started working on this subject since a couple of years. Microplastics were studied since the beginning of the 2000s, mostly in the marine environment, and in freshwater environments this has been studied since about 10 years, let's say, so it's a really, let's say, a new subject. I'm working at the German Federal Institute of Hydrology, and we study the River Elbe in northeastern Germany, and I will present you the results of our research. So, my colleagues published a paper in 2014 with the title Microplastics in Freshwater Ecosystems, What We Know and What We Need to Know. This was really, let's say, the beginning of this research in German rivers, and there they studied sediment samples of different rivers, the Elbe, the Neckar, the Mosel, and the Rhine, and they found microplastics in all samples. And there are some pictures, as you can see, and there were up to 60 microplastic particles per kilogram of sediment, but this was counted visually, so they missed many of the particles. The goal of our study in the last years was to quantify the microplastic abundance in water and sediments of the German part of the River Elbe, and also to better understand the sinks and the transport mechanisms of microplastics. Where did we sample? So this is the Elbe River from Czech to the North Sea, and we studied only the German part and took samples at 11 sites from Dessau via Hamburg and down to the North Sea. How did we sample? We had ships from the German Waterway Federation and sampled the water with manta nets with a mesh size of 150 micrometers and larger, and the sediments with a fine film grabber. And there we mostly went to the edge of the river in order to get fine-grained sediment. For the sample preparation, we did a different approach. The water samples we started with the destruction of the organic substance with hydrogen peroxide, and then did the density separation in order to separate the plastics from the rest of the sample. And the sediments, as the samples were quite large, up to 1 kilo of sediment sometimes, we first did a size fractionation, then a density separation, and then also the destruction of organic matter. Then the filtration is for the other sample as well, and then the analysis. The filter looks like that. The brown parts, this is still organic matter, as it sometimes takes much time with hydrogen peroxide to destroy it. But you also see the typical microplastics you can find in the environment as well. Here, this is a sphere, the primary microplastics, the round balls, which are produced for the industry, and they also are found in the environment. Then we have a fiber here, and the red thing is a fragment. What did we do? We had, so again, this filter. We first had a look at the digital microscope, photographed every single piece of plastic, measured it, and took the larger particles, so which had a size larger than 500 micrometers, from the filter, and then measured it in the RTR, Fourier transformed infrared spectrometer, and then we got information about every single particle of the polymer type. And then the filters, we also did the mass-based concentrations with the Pyrolysis Gcms in order to get information about how much milligram per kilogram sediment, for example, of microplastics we found in the sediment. For the results, here again we see pictures of microplastic we found in the River Elbe. Again, first the fibers, then these there are foils which are mostly used in the agriculture, then also fragments, and these typical spheres I also just showed you. Our main results were that we found microplastics in every single sample, but we found many more particles in the sediments than in the water phase. In the sediments, we found up to 18,000 particles per kilogram. There's a mistake, I just see, of sediment, and in the water phase there were about 1 to 13 particles, so not that much, but we also found particles there. Quite interesting is that we found fewer microplastics in the tidal influence area. If you have a look here at the figures, you see this red line, and from this up to down to the North Sea, there we have the tidal influence, and the red line also marks barrage, this probably stops, let's say, the sediments and the microplastics for being transported further downstream. So this was a quite interesting result, as we would have thought that we would find more plastics downstream, which are transported with the water at the river. But another fact is the tidal influence. We have much water which is transported, or which is changed every day from the North Sea up to this barrage, up to Dierkes. So this might also be an explanation for that. Regarding the size, we found an exponential increase with a decreasing particle size, which also makes sense here, as microplastics fragment into smaller pieces, and they stay a couple of 100 years in the environment, and they don't decompose. Another interesting result was the site of Dessau, which is here. In Dessau, we found of the sample 93% of spheres of these primary microplastics, which you see on the lower right picture in D. So almost the entire sample was made out of these particles. And this is probably a result from the industry and the environments. And this is what we studied in the Mulde, which I will show you on the slide afterwards. Now, just some words about the analysis. So that was really the result of the visual analysis, and then we analyzed each particle with the FTIR spectrometry. Every particle larger than 500 micrometers, and there we found some interesting results. As in the water phase, we just found the polymers polyethylene, polypropylene, and polystyrene, whereas in the sediment, it was more diverse, and there we also found PVC, PA, PET, or PMMA. But this is quite easy to explain, as these polymers also have a larger density than water, and thus it's more probable that they sink to the ground. Then for the Pyrolysis Gcms, there we have mass-based concentrations, so the information how many grams per cubic meter now we have in 1 cubic meter of water, for example, and then you see the results that we have about 10 to 50 grams per cubic meter of sample of microplastics, and in the downstream, again in the tidal influence area, we almost found nothing, so the concentrations were quite low. Quite interesting was the result for the smaller particles, as in 2 samples we had a high amount of PS, and this might be explained either by enhanced PS fragmentation, also by Kaya-type abrasion, as this is also it's a very large source of microplastics in the environment. The problem is only that it's very difficult to detect, as this changes quite a lot regarding the polymers and other composition. Then for this Dessau site, which I just showed you with the 90% of spheres, we sampled upstream and downstream of the confluence with the Elbe, which is here. Again, water and sediment, and these are the first results. So it's quite visible that downstream we found way more spheres than upstream of the confluence, and that means that via the Mulde River, these particles are transported to the Elbe and then stay there. And this is also visible here on the picture on the right side, the sample we took. So the white spots here, this is all these primary microplastics, which have a size of just 100 to 200 micrometers. So it's really a lot, and we are now at the stage to see where exactly it came from. As there in the environment some larger industrial sites, and they must come from there somewhere. So now for concluding, I gave you some insights now into microplastic research at the River Elbe in Germany. And with this research we could show that river and sediments are a sink for microplastics, because until now many researchers suggested that most of the plastics are transported via the rivers into the sea, but now we clearly see that this is not the case, and that rivers are also a sink for microplastics, and if they are there, they cannot be retained, so it's really important that they don't go into the environment. Then the microplastic concentrations decreased in flow direction, but that was most probably the case due to tidal influence and to barrage, which is quite important. Then I also showed that there are some microplastic hotspots due to industrial emissions. We also found higher microplastic concentrations in more populated areas, such as Hamburg, which is also quite thinkable and makes sense. And then we found the different polymers in water and sediment, especially PE, PP, and PS, but these are also the polymers which are used the mostly in the world for packaging and other stuff. And in the end, we also compared our results to concentrations of other rivers worldwide. The red spots here, this is the Elbe, the results from the Elbe, and the sediment and the water. And there we could see that our results are comparable to the Rhine and the Danube, for example. But here, the Yangtze, I think this is one of the samples here, there are quite higher concentrations than in the European rivers. And this is also what we want to do in our new European project, that we study the Elbe, the Thames, and the North Sea, and there we clearly want to see what part or what amount of plastics are transported via the rivers into the sea. There we will also study fish biota to see if also something ends up in the human body. So I hope this was a little insight into microplastic research, and thank you very much for your